Wayne's World, rising above the noise and confusion.
It's WaynesWord.
Oh.
Welcome to this edition of WaynesWord. Today we're going to talk about a shocking subject. I can't believe we're even having this conversation. I am old enough to remember when this country opposed, through the State Department and just through good activist liberal organizations, in fact, female genital mutilation of young girls and young women in places like Somalia, Mali, Egypt, Sudan, Sierra Leone, other underdeveloped countries, and we considered this a brutal attack on children and young women, and now it's become common in the United States. And Dr. Travis Morrell is here to tell us about that. Welcome to the show, Dr. Morrell.
Thank you, Wayne. Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Morrell, tell us a little bit about your background, where you came from, where you grew up, how you got into medicine.
Yeah, so I grew up in Fort Collins and Loveland, Colorado, just north of here. Beautiful Front Range. The mountains in the horizon at night are always going to be in my heart. And my mom was a nurse. My dad was a high school dropout, and I spent a lot of time after their divorce in the hospital, just kind of, sitting in the waiting room while my mom was working an evening shift or whatever. And it was always just an amazing thing to me for some reason, just a beautiful thing. And when I went into medical college, I ended up kind of being good at science, and I got a hold of human heart in my hand, and in a cadaver setting, by the way, not like a murder or something. And I just thought, wow, to actually work with humans and help them hands-on, that would be the most amazing thing. And that always was my experience. Medical school is the most fun. I had, honestly, a lot of fun in residency training for years longer than I should have. And I still feel like that in practice. I love taking care of people, and I love being a doctor. And that's why I talk about this, because a lot of people in this movement were affected because their kids were taken into this by a school or a doctor or something like that. And my kids are doing great, and they're thankfully not confused about their gender, much less medicalized for it. But I saw the harm that it would do to kids because I had prescribed the medicines, I had helped with the surgery with adults. And so it was very clear to me what this would do to kids. And I realized that if this were happening despite any evidence, it wasn't evidence that brought this about. It was something else called activism or something. And so it had to be stopped by people outside of it because the safeties are gone and it's not going to stop itself. And that's kind of how I got involved in speaking up.
Dr. Morrell, you live and practice in one of the most beautiful places on earth, Grand Junction, Colorado. I visit whenever I can. I love that town. Is this going on there the way that it is in the more urban centers of Colorado? Or are you seeing it?
Definitely. On the Stop the Harm database, my local hospitals have done this. Doctors have told me that they were uncomfortable because they were involved in doing this. Like, for example, anesthesiologists doing it for surgeons. And so it definitely happens in my town too. It's happening in if you have a hospital, it's happening in your town. You can look at stoptheharmdatabase.com, and you'll probably find your local rural or community hospital doing it.
Colorado is really sort of a petri dish for politics. People come here with radical ideas, radical agendas, and turn them into laws, either on the ballot or in the legislature. But this isn't limited to Colorado at all, is it? I mean, it maybe more common in this environment, but it's coast to coast.
No, it's coast to coast. And I have my heart in Colorado. I think it's just the most beautiful state. And I also think it's probably the worst state for gender ideology as far as laws. But I have friends in other states, California, Connecticut, Washington, Oregon, that have very similar stories, to be honest.
Do doctors still take the Hippocratic oath saying do no harm? First, do no harm?
Well, I did. And I don't think that's an optional things. The whole point of an oath is that at some point, the reason you said it, at some point, you might have to keep it and you're not going to want to. That's why you make an oath. And so a lot of us right now need to think about this because our profession is perpetuating a harm, and we need to, as a first principle, not help, because sometimes if you help before you do no harm, you might do something bad that actually harms somebody. So you have to use your brain a little bit. So it's not first help, actually. It's first do no harm. So we need to sit back. We need to look at the evidence. We need to think this through. We need to talk to people that agree and disagree with us. And then we need to first do no harm and then go on and be doctors from there.
It's unusual that a physician with, a highly trained physician is speaking out about this. Why is the rest of the medical community so silent on this?
Great question. And I found some detransitioners and parents really frustrated by that. The good answer that I have is it's changing quickly, that more and more doctors are speaking up. And in my state, I found that a lot of doctors wanted to speak up, or they even were speaking up with their immediate kind of contacts, but they didn't know how to speak up in public or even within their organizations. And so there's more organizations. I started one in Colorado called Colorado Principled Physicians. People can find it at coloradodoctors.org. Hope it's okay. I did some free advertising there. And also nationally, I'm a senior fellow with Do No Harm. And Do No Harm is probably the number one leader in making change in this way in the country. And so people, now that doctors are finding ways to speak up, they are wanting to do so. And we're seeing more and more speak up in the Denver Capitol and in other ways. That being said, why did it take them so long? Why are they not speaking up more? There's a lot of reasons. I think the biggest reason is just we all defer to each other to a great extent. We all trust each other. You're the expert in this. You're the expert in that. If you say it, then I guess it's good. In our conversation, we were saying, for most of us, if there was good evidence for this for kids, we'd be for it. And we just assume that surely our colleagues have good evidence or they wouldn't do it. So we just trust them. But that circle of trust has been broken by activists, not really by most doctors. The other thing is a lot of us are employed and we don't want to get fired, or we don't want to lose our position in our academia, or we don't want to have to deal with our insurance company or getting Google bombed on our reviews. And so there is some pushback in that kind of sense, in addition to the laws that we've kind of spoken about in Colorado and other states that kind of make you afraid that you might have some problem with your license.
There's a lot of politics that go on in medicine. I noticed that it seems like anyone who wants to achieve something legislatively, politically, if they put a white coat to speak about it, and that's kind of what we're doing here. But this goes on all the time.
Doctors are being tools for activists right now, and we are kind of laundering activist policies through a white coat. That is going on. And it's easy to see. Just go to any library, find a medical journal, and read the index for the last 12 months. And you'll see stuff like doctors are experts on education policy, transportation policy, energy policy. My favorite is nuclear anti-proliferation. Like, what do you think in medical school I studied about nuclear anti-proliferation or nuclear war? And all these things are being passed as medicine, either under the auspices of public health, saying public health is medicine, or under the idea called social determinants of health, where everything in society determines your health, and therefore doctors, instead of fixing your health, should fix society. And we're being told straight up that we should be activists instead of doctors.
Doctors are revered in this society, and that's a good thing, but it's being exploited by these activists.
I can't say it better than that. Doctors are revered because real medicine works. And for years, we have focused on evidence-based medicine that really works in people's lives. But now we're kind of, not most of us, I don't think, but some of us are being used as tools, and we're selling out our profession to pass activist policies. And I bet it feels good for those doctors. I don't know, but eventually we're going to lose that reverence. And we're losing it fast because people can see through this and they're not going to trust their doctor.
How common is this in the United States?
We don't know for sure. There's been at least 3 good papers that have published how many kids are getting some kind of what you were kind of referencing as genital mutilation, which can be puberty blockers, hormones, or surgery. And we know that there's thousands a year. We know that that's been increasing by 20% every year the past 5 or so years. And we know that, for example, in Colorado, Do No Harm's Stop the Harm database says that 54 hospitals have produced insurance data that means that they're doing this to kids under 17 and a half.
So this goes on at Children's Hospital, which is a world-renowned hospital in Denver. and this is one of their specialties now.
Yeah, I mean, Children's Hospital, I love that place. Save somebody's life. That's very important to me. Young kid with cancer, but at the same time, I know another young kid who's 13 who's getting puberty blockers there. That's chemically castrating him, and it's against his dad's wishes. And so I have a hate-love relationship with Children's Hospital for that.
So when this is done in other countries, it's sort of a cultural thing. We used to consider it sort of a remnant of the Dark Ages, religious thing, fanatical religious practice. This in the United States is done in the name of what? Gender transitioning?
Yeah, you're right. A good way to look at this is a religion or a cult or a false science. And yes, so in China, they do foot binding they used to, and that's horrible. And now we do breast binding, and that's good because it's this false cult of gender ideology. In Yemen and Sudan, like you said, Somalia, they do female genital mutilation in different ways. They restrict a young girl's healthy anatomy so she can't have sex as well when she's older. And that's bad. And doctors have been saying that's bad for decades. I was very much against it the first few years out of my medical training. All my organizations were preaching against female genital mutilation for the reasons that you're taking away healthy, functional tissue for someone's life when they're a kid. And in those cultures, in Yemen, Sudan, the parents, the grandparents, even the mothers and grandmothers say it's a good idea. You have the so-called hygiene or health people that are respected in the culture say it's a bad idea. You have the religious leaders. Everybody says it's a good idea, but it doesn't make it right. It's always been wrong. And in this country, even though we have federal laws against female genital mutilation, some of the medicines like puberty blockers and testosterone for young women does some of the same things. It damages their vaginal development. It causes uncomfortable growth of their clitoris. And we have detransitioners talking about how bad this is. We have data that probably 80-90% of people or more of these young people on cross-sex hormones like testosterone have major pelvic, sexual, urinary side effects by the time they're even 18 sometimes. So we know that this is going to harm kids, and we know that there's going to be long-term effects, and we should have the moral clarity as doctors and as adults. You don't need to be a doctor to understand this, to say this shouldn't be done to kids.
You're not anti-trans, I take it. I'm not. I don't care about the trans movement one way or another. I believe that you have done some gender surgeries, gender affirming surgeries, would you call it?
So in the past, I have, in my first 4 years out of medical school, when I was a young doctor, I did assist with at the time they called it sex reassignment surgery. And now we phrase it differently. I presented on that at a regional conference. I spent time prescribing cross-sex hormones to adults. And so, there's no reasonable world where you would call me anti-trans. But of course, now anybody that doesn't actively give this to children is anti-trans.
These are two very different things. I mean, an adult who is post 18 years of age or 21 years of age, whatever you want to define as adulthood. But I think a lot of people are okay with 18 being adulthood. If somebody wants to, feels the need to transition, that's not something that should be illegal or that I would find. I wouldn't want that for anyone who I know and care about and love. I wouldn't oppose it either if that was their will. But this is different. This is children we're talking about.
I'll say when I was first out in a different position, I read everything that the WPATH, World Professional Association for Transgender Health, said to do, and I took it as gospel. I think even for adults, we need to have probably better research and have these discussions at a more science or evidence-based level. But clearly for youth, it's just clearly wrong to do this. When you have the WPATH, their president say, kids, boys that are put on puberty blockers at this young age, like Colorado Medicaid pays for when you're 8, 10, 12, and then they're switched on to estrogen when they're a little bit older. Dr. Marcy Bowers, the president of their organization, said she didn't know of any boy who went through that regimen that was able to have an orgasm. And so you just think, well, if that kid grows up to be gay, like we know many kids in this situation do, or wants to have a trans surgery, they're going to have less surgical options, less relational options. So that was what really hit me when I realized this stuff is hurting the people that I'm supposed to be helping. And that's when I knew it was something was broken there.
What age does this start at?
Puberty blockers are supposed to be started in this mindset as early as Tanner stage 2. That's the doctor word for saying as soon as puberty starts. And in 95% of kids, that's age 8 to 13.
So 8-year-olds are doing this.
I mean, it can be as young as 8. It can be as young as 8.
Can the 8-year-old become 15 and say, oh, I wish I hadn't done that and I want to change my mind?
Well, they really rolled this out with having good data on this, which is just a huge shame to the profession. Other kids, for example, puberty blockers are used in conditions like precocious puberty. But when you talk to endocrinologists, that's puberty that starts when you're like 5. And it really shouldn't start till you're 8, 10, 12. And even then, you talk to endocrinologists, which I'm not one, they say, really use this as short as possible, as limited as possible, as few months as possible. Now, any medicine, even a bad medicine, even a poison, I could probably put you on it for a month and, your body's amazing. Maybe things will work out. But if you're putting this kid on it for some amount of time and then switching them to cross-sex hormones, no, there's permanent effects. They know they have case series where kids' intelligence will drop, their intelligence, their IQ, their operating memory, which is like working memory, will drop. And we have studies in 2024, there was a study of studies, a high-level research paper that showed, looking at all these studies where kids had maybe had intelligence problems with the puberty blockers, and in none of these studies did it show any hope that intelligence bounced back after they stopped the medicine. And that's kind of intuitive. If you're older than 20 or 30, you've seen hundreds of people in your life from around 10 to around 20 become different people. Your brain grows, your sex organ grows, your muscles grow, if you're a guy especially. And when there's no second puberty, those hormones are pushing growth, not just of your sex organs, but your whole body. And your brain is very dependent on that. And your brain is unique for its sex. And so if you stop that, there's no second sequel to puberty where you can get all that intelligence, all that bone structure, and regrow your sex organs. There's no second chance.
So when that's blocked at the time that you're supposed to go through that, it interrupts something that's supposed to happen in your life, and it'll never happen again.
Yeah, there's no second puberty. They try to call it a pause. But they're called puberty blockers for a reason. They're blocking the puberty from occurring. You give this to adults, guys with prostate cancer, older ladies with ovarian cancer for salvage therapy, they'll cry every day. I have Marine patients that cried every day for a couple of years on this medicine. And you talk to people like Chloe Cole. She went through a menopause at age 13 while she was on this medicine, crying every day, moody, depressed. That's what it does. And there's no time. You don't get to 20 and your body's like, oh, he never had puberty, let's do it now. That doesn't happen. You have one shot. There's no second chance.
I don't understand how we could be interfering with the natural development of an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old for that matter.
Well, I don't understand either, but I think if you, in any kind of ethical or medical sense, from any kind of medical reasoning, but from what I can understand from people who have talked to me and had this experience, and then also people on the other side trying to argue for this, and also looking at the history of the research. Basically, this was done for adults, starting in America with Harry Benjamin in the 40s, I believe it was. So he brought this kind of idea over from Germany, from this guy Magnus Hirschfeld at the Institute for Sexual Science. And basically, in all history, if you had somebody that had some kind of mental problem, okay, you treated the mental problem. Today, if you have false pregnancy, I've treated patients with false pregnancy. It's called pseudocyesis. A woman comes to your labor and delivery, which is what I used to do more than a decade ago, and you would, and she's 100% sure that she's pregnant. Now, what you do for that patient is you check blood tests, do an ultrasound, and if they're not pregnant, you don't do a C-section, right? Patients have delusions of parasitosis. They're sure that they have a bug. You don't treat them with medicine to kill the bug. If somebody's manic and they want to drive fast, take chances, have sex with everybody, do coke, and gamble all their money, you don't say, good idea, that sounds great, right? Anytime you have some kind of delusion or just kind of, you're just a little bit off of reality. We never encourage that. But in this one field for adults, I think it was Alfred Kinsey referred the first patient to Harry Benjamin back in the 40s and said, look, this guy, we just can't get out of his head. Why don't you change his body instead of changing his mind? And over the decades, we've continued to do that to a small amount of adults. But some of those adults say, you did it to me too late. I'm 30, I'm 50, I'm 60, and I already have a beard and I already have my bone shape and whatever. And so the idea is to try to do it to younger kids so that they'll have better aesthetic outcomes when they're older.
My wife and I have brought up 6 boys, and I can tell you more than one of them like to play with dolls at young ages, at 8, 9, 10 years old, put on girls' shoes. And we never had a big issue with that. It didn't concern us. I didn't really care how they developed in terms of their sexuality or anything like that. But I think that there are parents out there who see that type of behavior and they think, oh, well, Johnny is really a girl.
Well, it's suspicious. I've seen a parent that had 4 kids that were either trans or non-binary, and you're like, wow, four kids, that's statistically improbable for something that used to be, less than 1% of the population, that you'd have 4 kids all that way. So, I mean, there definitely is a social pressure among some adults that you are a better person if this is your situation at home. I'm not saying by far that these people are doing this consciously. We all do things for secondary gain. We do things that, makes us a little more money or makes us a little more popular or makes us look better. We do that subconsciously sometimes. And also, this is happening to a lot of parents that aren't doing that. So I'm not saying it's the only thing. In kids, I had a friend in Grand Junction, which is, that used to be Lauren Boebert country. It's not left-leaning in any way. And I had a friend whose kid in a public school, 23 out of 24 kids in their class were, pansexual, trans, non-binary, something like that. So you can't tell me there's not some kind of social element or social contagion.
Social contagion, that's a good word for it, I think. What are some of the long-term effects of hormone treatments, puberty blockers? Are you seeing that children who do this grow up to be adults who have big problems?
Well, it really never happened in America until 2007. And it really didn't happen in America with any kind of numbers until around 2017 or so. And it's been increasing rapidly since then. So we don't have long-term data. And that's the kind of thing you probably would have wanted before you put something dangerous to kids. Now, that said, we are having detransitioners report problems, and we do have some studies that show harm.
Is there a high regret rate among people who transition, gender transition, and I'm talking about adults and children? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, we do have data. Again, a good answer might be we don't really know for sure, and they sure as hell should have figured that out before they started doing it outside of experiments to your kids. That being said, we do have data, and there's probably 2 groups of patients that you should kind of think about. One is the patients for decades who came to their doctors with gender dysphoria. And for decades, our best data that's been in the Psychiatric Bible for 3 editions says that up to 98% of kids, if you don't put them on any kind of medicine or surgery, they just grow out of it. So the first group of kids is the ones that never get medicine, never get hormones, never get surgery. And in that group of kids, somewhere between 60 and 98% of kids just grow out of it totally fine. So if you do a natural kind of thought experiment, if we had put them on puberty blockers, some boy at 13 or 12 put him on puberty blockers, hormones on through adulthood, he ends up with a 1-inch penis and can't have sex for his whole life, can't have an orgasm, can't reproduce. That kid, we might agree, is probably going to regret it. And so if you medicalize those kids, which up to 98% were never going to need medicine, you're going to have a really high regret rate, I think we can safely predict. Now, the other evidence that we have is more recently, kids that have been medicalized, that have gotten puberty blockers or hormones. And it's really hard to find regret rates because it's not well studied, which again, as Dr. Elizabeth Jensen has said, that's a feature of organizational safety failures. They purposely don't keep track of their own mistakes, which perpetuates the mistakes. We haven't done the correct studies that we should have for this. But in that data, we do have some studies. There was one recent one in the United States with 1,000 kids, average age 19. And within 4 years, about 30% of kids had stopped medicalizing. We have the best study on this is kind of a systematic review. It was in 2021, and it showed supposedly a 1% regret rate. This is the best argument that the other side has. But if you read the study, and you don't really have to be a doctor to kind of figure this out, they have a almost 40%, 30 to 40% loss of follow-up, and they only followed people for 3, 4, maybe 5 years. So even their best study kind of matches with kind of a good study that actually kept follow-up of all their patients. Probably in 4 years, you're looking at around 30 or 40%. We have other data through insurance in Germany and in the United States that within 5 to 7 years, most kids stop medicalizing.
I'm no doctor or scientist, but I am a parent who's raised 6 children. And I can tell you, even just from being a human being, I have gone through dramatic changes in my life. And I will tell you, I mentioned that I've had boys, young boys who like to play with dolls and do girl things. I had one teenager who was a cheerleader, and he was a thespian, and he hung out with all the girls. And that was in October. By the following spring, he had quit all of that, and he was a bull rider. And I said, what's going on? You've changed your interests so dramatically in school. He said, I went through puberty in November and things changed. And I didn't have any problem with who he was before then, but there was a dramatic change in this child that was just physiological.
What you're saying is actually more important than anything I've said. And that is, you don't need to be a doctor to understand when something's just not even medicine. And any adult knows, especially if you're 25, 35, 40, that the number of kids you want, who you want to be with when you're 12, 8, 13, maybe have never had sex, maybe never masturbated, never had an erection, what you think you want to do when you're 8, 10, 12 versus 20, 25, 35, 40 is wildly different for a lot of us. And so you can't permanentize something for kids that they'll have to live with the rest of their life. That's just wrong, and it's not medicine. And unfortunately, medicine has a history of making mistakes. I'd encourage your listeners to read the WPATH Files by Mia Hughes, and she kind of goes through how we did crazy things in the late 1800s and early 1900s to women for so-called hysteria. I won't even repeat what we did. We did lobotomies for 20 years in America. One that I like to mention is that we told parents to put their kids down to sleep, which was increasing the risk of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, for I think about 3 years longer than other countries like the UK and Australia, when they realized the evidence showed, no, you got to put the kids back to sleep. It's safer to put your kid back to sleep. And we kept telling kids that. The American Academy of Pediatrics kept
as opposed to on their stomachs, on their backs.
Exactly. And the data was the data was actually there for decades, and other countries figured it out a couple years before us, and we kept doing it. And there was an increased number of kids that died while we in America kind of dragged our feet. And so my point is, you don't need to be a doctor sometimes to say, that doesn't sound like medicine. And this is definitely one of those times.
You wrote a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal recently, and it says, beware the rising generation of physicians. And you warn in here that a lot of medical students are now, I suppose if there's a social contagion, they are catching the social contagion. Tell us what happened when you tried to get the Colorado Medical Society to speak out against or pass a resolution against this type of treatment for children.
I had the opportunity to submit a policy proposal to the Colorado Medical Society, which is a great organization that I'm proud to be a part of and has done a lot of good in the state for physicians and patients. And so I submitted a policy that said, hey, we, as the Colorado Medical Society, have made a proposal and made a policy in 1996 and again in 2014 saying we're against female genital mutilation. Now you might think, why did we need that? Because that's not really something ever done in Colorado. Maybe it's kind of performative. It's really done in Yemen and Sudan, the Middle East and North Africa. But we had those policies anyway. And resubmitted them and revoted them in 2014. So we're willing to take that kind of medical and ethical position to protect girls across the country, across the world. Why don't we take that same position and protect girls under 18 from puberty blockers, hormones, and mastectomy and other surgeries? And I submitted that policy. I was very proud that of Colorado doctors that voted, it was over 62% of doctors that voted in favor of it, 62%. So that's 62% of doctors that didn't just say this was a bad or we should look at the evidence, but that said doing this to kids is mutilation. And so I was happy to prove, I guess, to myself that I was right. I thought most doctors were against this, and this was kind of a hijacked institutional problem, and I was proud to see that was right. However, the last couple days of voting, all of a sudden, a very large number of medical students voted, and it was, instead of 62% in favor of my policy, it was somewhere around 96% against it. And the board of the medical society, they can do whatever they want, really, and they decided not to pass the policy.
This was mostly medical students at any particular medical school, or was it various medical schools?
Well, there's two medical schools in Colorado. The most prestigious one is the University of Colorado School of Medicine. And it came out later in the Publica that a CU professor who is a physician emailed his students and basically, I think he called me unethical and, I don't know, bigoted or something, and said, you need to vote for this. It turns out that in Colorado, if you're a doctor, you have to pay almost $1,000 to become a medical society member and vote. But if you're a student, you can vote for free.
And all students are members, correct?
So all students are automatically members if they click on the website.
But not all practicing physicians are
actually
members.
No.
So of those who were members, dues-paying members, most of them sided with you until the students came along.
Of the ones that voted. And there was other policies, and we had about the same number of people vote in ours as all the other policies. But even though most doctors said this was mutilation, by far, most medical students voted against it. And we're talking Russia numbers, Putin presidency election numbers, 96%.
That shows you how much influence one professor can have over an entire campus of students, doesn't it?
It's concerning.
So what about boys? You talk a lot about female mutilation. This is going on with boys as well, isn't it?
Yes, that's true.
Do we do any? Do you know of any surgical mutilation that's going on in Colorado with young people?
So by far, historically, this was mostly boys, and in this new young kind of, especially the teen group, it's by far mostly girls. That's partly why we address to girls. But to boys, there is more rarely genital mutilation, where they will remove the testicles, castrate the person permanently so they can never have kids, and then invert the shaft. And you can imagine that that's much worse to do after they've been on the puberty blockers, because if you're on puberty blockers and testosterone until you're an adult, you're going to have a 1-inch long penis, maybe 1.5 inches. That's not long enough to have tissue to safely make a neovaginal wall. And so it is done to boys. I think that's probably very rare, and it's more rare than mastectomy to girls. But it is done. I mean, it was Jazz Jennings did it on TV. It was done to Jazz Jennings, I should say, on TV in, I think, 2017, 2018. So it is, as much as people say it's not being done, I mean, it's on, I think it was the Learning Channel.
I'm trying to get a feel for how prevalent this is. Is this something that just happens once in a while, every couple of months, or is this common?
Let's take Denver Health. Denver Health, as you know, is kind of the catchment hospital for anybody that needs health care in Denver, and they do a lot of good work there. When you look at Stop the Harm database, that's stoptheharmdatabase.com. That's Do No Harm took real insurance data, so we are pretty nearly 100% sure that these numbers reflect actual patients. We took out anybody over 17 and a half so that we know it's actual kids. It's not 19-year-olds or something like that.
You're not distorting the number with somebody who's almost 18.
Exactly. We wanted to be sure that this is a conservative estimate, a fair estimate. And what they found is at Denver Health, actually in 5 years, it's only like 11 kids that got puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery. However, when I was at testimony a few weeks ago in Denver, 3 or 4 doctors came from Denver Health. I think there was 4 pediatricians, 3 were from Denver Health. One of them testified that she had treated herself 200 kids with medical gender medicine. And so the question is raised, and I've heard from other people through back doors, this is hearsay, that the number's obviously higher than 200 because that's only one doctor. So is it hundreds of kids per hospital or 11? I don't know. I can tell you that one thing that would make those numbers different is if doctors weren't coding patients as transgender, but were miscoding. And that would not show up in our database as it currently stands.
That's easy to do, isn't it?
Well, it's not only easy to do, WPATH currently today on their website tells doctors to do it.
And what's the reason for that?
Well, the reason I would assume is to get it covered by insurance.
Okay, so if insurance doesn't cover this type of treatment, you just report it as something else.
Right.
Sounds like insurance fraud right there.
Yes.
But a large portion of the Democratic majority in the House and Senate in Colorado is appointed. They're not representative really of the public because people resign, and then they have this system where they appoint people, and they've appointed some pretty extreme, radical left-wing Democrats who are not mainstream Democrats at all. This legislature, this session, is now passing a dead-naming bill is what they call it. You could lose custody of a child very easily if the child changes his name from John to Sally and you accidentally, even just by accident, call the child John. This gives the court rationale. In fact, the way the bill is written, the court must take into consideration the dead naming and consider it a form of coercion. In other words, child abuse.
Yeah, absolutely horrible, and kind of a part of our nuclear meltdown of rights and child safety on every level.
Why is the legislature racing a bill through late bill status, like as if it's an emergency, to pass this?
Well, you're right. They are racing it. They're cutting corners. They're getting rid of debate. So you're right that they're doing that. And I think the reason is because we're in what safety engineers call an organizational safety failure. Dr. Elizabeth Jensen has published on this, and she's a safety engineer. And she says that basically when you get to the point that you're not going to accept outside input, and safety failures often happen when you have a very inbred or isolated leadership, like you mentioned, a lot of our legislators are now appointed, so they're all each other's friends or whatever. They're in each other's friend groups. You start getting this isolated group of people not open to outside influence, and what happens is there's no brakes for that train. The Chernobyl nuclear reactor is gonna blow, and there's no place to shut it down. And so they're just gonna keep doubling down. And this is just what Dr. Jensen predicted this a year or two ago, and she's been right so far. They're just going to keep making worse bills.
Where does it go from here?
It's going to keep getting worse. Again, this bill is already the policy here in action. We had a dad, his name is Robert Cameron. His 13-year-old is getting this puberty blockers at Colorado Children's Hospital against his will. And when they went through divorce, the court sides with the mom, not with him, because they don't like that he's not supportive of the gender. And I know of other parents that's happening to. So this is already our policy. This is the Colorado legislators saying, hey, we got your back and we're going to go further and further from here.
Parents could use this against one another. Usually in a divorce situation, the child wants to be with the more lenient parent, less of the one that's less disciplinarian. And this creates an opportunity for the child and one parent to say, well, you dead named me. You're not calling me by the right name. I would think this opens up a Pandora's box. I mean, for abuse, we have a lot of predatory lawyers in this state. We have a fairly easy bar exam in Colorado. And there are a lot of phone book lawyers who are always looking for something. And this is I would think this is a big new niche for them.
Wayne, I grew up in a divorced home. And if you've been through divorce or lived in that situation as a kid, you know that can happen as parents. And I think anybody looking at this with some sanity knows this is a chip in a divorce situation for custody. If I might go back to one question you asked, is with this bill, HB 25-1312, it basically requires social transition for kids, that going along with their new name and identity. I would say that it definitely will cause physical harm to kids. And the reason is, from what we know, the Cass review openly said this, Baroness Cass said this from the UK, that social transition increases the risk of a kid being medicalized. And if you look at studies, once kids medicalized, in some of the studies that we have, 98% of kids from medicalized go on to be operated on. So you're putting kids, when you go along with social transition, you're going along with something it's not true. They can't be made into the other sex. It's not successful for us to do that. And it's not going to fix all the stress and harm and the stress and pain that they're dealing with. But once you affirm that, they end up on a one-way train. And so I do think it's going to cause physical harm to these kids.
You said you can't go from being a boy to a girl or a man to a woman. That's not possible, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's two different sexes, and every mammalian organism, evolutionists say for 500 million years, is either a male, or a female. And every organism at some point in its life, if healthy and if it develops on the right path, will either make large, immobile, non-moving gametes like an egg or an ovum, or small, swimming, mobile gametes like sperm. There's not a third gamete. There's not a third sex. There's not half and half or a both. There's only two. And we know even just socially that this doesn't work. When you if you go up to your favorite friend that thinks this is a great idea for kids and tell her, she looks great. When did you go through your transition? And she's going to be offended. And if you go up to 99 out of 100 of your heterosexual friends that are in favor of doing this to kids and ask them, hey, do you ever date or sleep with trans women? And again, 98, 99% of them are going to say no. And the woman's going to be offended if you call her trans. All adults know that this is kind of like a polite lie. Kids don't know that. And that's why it's not fair to kids. And that's why we see a very high number of autistic kids and other kids that have trouble trusting people too much, and they're being taken advantage of.
So you really think that this so-called dead naming bill, I don't like that reference, but that's what they're calling it, will lead children to the sex, the physical gender transitions that we've been talking about? We'll see a lot more of it.
Yeah, you're definitely going to see more of it in the families that this affects. Yes, definitely, because social transition leads to medical transition. And with social transition, you're asking a parent to forget the name they gave their child when she was born, to forget all those memories for years of that child and their actual sex, and lie to the kid. And once you give in to that lie, then it's a logical next step to medicalize and surgerize. And we have people like Plume, I think, is the company that's advertising right now online and, giving points and bonuses if you start your gender transition. And I don't know if it's aimed at adults or kids, but I mean, this is a gamified, encouraged thing. You go online and you start your transition, you're going to get love bombed. Everybody's going to encourage you. And so to make the parent do that in the sanctity of their own home, 100% that's going to stop the one last line of protection for these kids, and they're going to get long-term harm.
What does it say about women when men are going around pretending to be women? I mean, we used to see this way back when this country was more racist than it is today. Thank God it's not still. We had what were called minstrel shows. And in those shows, men would make fun of women. They would dress like women and to mock them, to make fun of them. They would also wear blackface to make fun of black people. Do you see a big difference between this movement and what was common back then for entertainment purposes?
Well, I can tell you that a lot of my new friends are feminists or trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, which is a name they love, and I'm proud of them for taking that on as a badge of love and honor. Yeah, they'll say this is woman face. Time after time, you see men win beauty awards or get on the magazine cover, or now they're winning sports competitions. And to a woman, this is woman face. You're putting on a dress, wearing long hair, trying to fake some mannerisms, and then you're taking their leadership opportunity, their scholarship opportunity, their bathroom. And I mean, it's really unfair. And I'd probably be more mad if I were a woman. But I do think woman face is a good term that people should think of. We should know, your listeners may already know this, but a lot of the men that are going into this, there's been men for years that have had what we understand as gender dysphoria, a small number of men. But a lot of the men in this movement right now deal with what's called autogynephilia. I don't know if you've talked about that in your podcast before, but a recent detransitioner talked to me about this, that there was his own experience is, unfortunately, guys start going down a road, and let's put it this way. One of my friends said, anything weird that a guy is doing that's hard to explain, it's because of sex. And the fact is that there are some guys, and it's an increasing number, that get turned on by the idea that they themselves are a woman. And so you have people that they don't necessarily really think that they're a woman. They just get turned on by the idea that they are. And of course they're not. And of course no medicine or surgery is going to make them into one, but it may be good for them in their own free time, I guess, so to speak. And so this is there's not any reality to this idea that puberty blockers or hormones can change a young boy into a girl, but it's an advantageous situation for some adult guys to have this, and it is woman face.
What we have here is a real social phenomenon. It's not really anything backed by medicine or science that you could transition and become a woman, a real woman.
How so? Men cannot breastfeed. With all the hormones in the world, they're still not producing the immunoglobulins, proteins, and lactose that would make real human milk. With all the surgery in the world, if you ever could put a uterus into a man and somehow incubate a pregnancy, which would be truly incredible feat of science, we're not anywhere close to that. That baby would be in a jailhouse of doom because there's no way out safely, right? So there's every cell in your body has the SRY chromosome, SRY gene if you're a man, and they don't if you're a girl.
We're going to get in trouble. Well, both are going to get in trouble for talking about this like we are. I don't know. I mean, it's strange that we can't have an honest conversation and ask these questions without it. But people are going to be outraged by this type of discussion. But so since we're already into this, what if I decided that I self-identified as Black, and I came to you and I said I would like to transition to become a Black person?
Yeah, I don't do cosmetic surgery anymore, but most people would be very offended if we tried to switch you to being Black and increase your melanin pigment so that you could pass as Black. Most people would be very offended at that.
It could be done medically, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, I don't know that I'm not aware of anybody doing that, but in theory, it wouldn't be difficult to upregulate your melanin pigment. I don't know. So but no one would be okay with you passing as a Black person. But right now you'd be heralded if you pass as a woman.
Any idea why?
The person that explains it the best is, in my view, James Lindsay. And I think he explains it as kind of a political opportunistic situation. Whereas right now, this is what politically works for certain activists. And the kind of Black-white divide and increasing that divide is very advantageous for some people. And the kind of this trans and non-trans, what they call cis people, divide, increasing that divide also breeds kind of distrust in society and also breeds pretty intense activists, as you may have noticed.
What do you think the effect is going to be on girls and women's athletics?
Yeah, I'm real proud of the girls at Thompson Valley, which is just up north from us about 2 hours, and the recent fencer, Stephanie, in the Northeast that have stood up against this. But in Colorado, the more laws that we prohibit misgendering, so-called, and dead naming, so-called, you're going to have more opportunity to take away leadership and sports opportunities from girls.
But it's not seen that way politically, or I don't think socially. I think most people just see this as sort of a new civil rights movement, and we're being accepting and unifying, when in fact what you're describing is something that's quite divisive.
Well, you're exactly right. And We should take note, too, that in Colorado, Section 8 and 9 of this bill, HB 251312, actually requires anybody to so-called public accommodation, which I'm not an attorney, but that's pretty much any business that serves the public, is also going to be required to abide by these so-called misgendering and so-called dead name laws. In fact, we already passed a law earlier this session that prohibits morticians or funeral home directors from this. So this is really going to affect everyone, and I'm sure they'll go even further after this. But you're right to nail it as a false construction of human rights. Candace Jackson spoke at an event that I co-hosted this Sunday. She's the Deputy General Counsel for the Department of Education, Candace Jackson, great attorney, great civil rights attorney. And she mentioned that this is false rights, false religion, false science. And you nailed the false rights. I think a lot of lesbian and gay people worked really hard to try to get rights to get married. And following that, in 2015, they all went home with their partners. But those buildings that were fighting for gay rights, human rights campaign, GLAAD, they basically were left with a few people that really had radical views on trans. And that's why since 2015, we've seen this really ramp up among our kids and our laws and everything like that. And a lot of people, they see this, and if it's not really affecting their life, especially, they just say, oh, well, there was rights for women, and then there was rights for African Americans, and then there's right for gays, and so this is rights for trans. And they haven't really given it the right kind of thinking through, and they've latched onto this as a rights movement, and it's not. It's a false rights movement. In fact, as you see, it's taking away the rights of parents to their freedom of speech, to their freedom of religion, and also, I believe it's the 14th Amendment, freedom of parents to kind of decide to protect their kids and decide how they should be raised.
And it's really going to affect businesses. Like you said, this goes to places of public accommodation. I can't think of very many businesses that don't fit that description.
There's not a coincidence that Colorado's produced Masterpiece Cake 1, Masterpiece Cake 2, and also Theater 3 Creative, which are all very similar of discrimination bills, discrimination cases that went to the Supreme Court. It's not a coincidence this keeps coming out of Colorado.
Why Colorado? Why is this happening here as opposed to even California doesn't have a law like this?
I think it goes back to Jared Polis, Gil, Stryker, and there's another
Rut Bridges
that basically decided a few decades ago, we got tons of money and we can make Colorado into whatever we want. And I want to shake Jared Polis's hand. He's done a great job of that. It's kind of getting to be a hellhole for rights, but I mean, he did a great job. He called his shot and he did it. Congratulations. And one of the things that I think is a player is our Civil Rights Commission, which is misnamed. I think it was Justice Gorsuch that said being sent there is like re-education in a communist country. So that whole false rights has really been transposed onto civil rights in this state, and we're way down the road on that.
Re-education, Jack Phillips, a cake designer, an artist. I mean, he doesn't just bake cakes. Anybody can bake a cake. He'll bake a cake for absolutely anybody who wants one. But he designs cakes, and he gets to know a couple very well before, in advance of a wedding. He wants to know what their hobbies are, their interests, what's important to them, and he designs a cake around that. He declined to design cakes for same-sex marriages. Now, we can all have our opinions on that. That's something he chose not to do. It seems like that it would be his right to not have to design something. I can't just order somebody to paint a picture of something they find offensive. Whether you agree with him taking offense or not, or having an objection to that, it's his right. And the Supreme Court ruled as such. The Civil Rights Commission in Colorado is a very brutal entity, and it has thumbed its nose now at least twice at the Supreme Court, both in the 303 Creative case and the Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Civil Rights Commission. This has become an activist state that is, I think that Jared Polis and Tim Gill and Rut Bridges and Pat Stryker, when they did what's called the Colorado Blueprint, I think their intentions were good. I think they wanted to enhance rights for the LGBTQ community. I don't really have a problem with that. That seems reasonable, but it's gone way beyond that.
Jared Polis is a likable guy.
No, he's definitely a very affable man. And a good father, I believe.
likable guy, smart guy, successful guy. And I think a lot of people wrapped up in this are good people, or they're trying to do good. They're not trying to hurt these kids. But we've all done things that we thought was great, and we learned a little more later, and we realized we had our foot in our mouth or did the wrong thing. And the problem is, I will say with Jared Polis, he has gone, like a lot of our legislators, a long way. And I don't know that there's a clear way back, especially without him saying, sorry, I really screwed up for years on multiple issues. So I don't, just like if right now I started making fun of you or giving you a hard time, which would be hard for me to come up with a reason to, Wayne, you're a good guy, but say
Thank you.
You're welcome. But say I did, your natural response, just like mine would be to defend yourself. And so whether these people are caught up in a false rights organization, a false religion, a false science, your natural behavior is to kind of fight back. And I think that even with yourself, if you're like, did I do the wrong thing? And when I'm Jared Polis and I passed that conversion ban in 2019 that also kind of requires therapists to affirm, well, you're not going to want to think about the 5 years of kids ushered down permanent lifelong medicalization that's your fault. And just to keep your ego happy so you can sleep at night, you're going to lie to yourself and say it wasn't a big deal and you did the right thing. And I don't blame people. In fact, I'm kind of a softie. I'm sympathetic to people in this situation. I'm sympathetic to Jared Polis, who I think has done a lot of evil. But I hope that at some point they're going to be willing to say, man, I messed up and I'm sorry. And the best I can do is make it right from here on out.
Well, you can take anything to an extreme, anything too far. And this seems, when you start getting into children's lives like this, that seems a bridge too far to me. What would you say if you were speaking to Governor Jared Polis right now regarding this dead naming bill that is going to end up on his desk?
I would say, Governor Polis, with respect, please don't sign this bill. Not only is it going to be bad for you politically, I know you have big aspirations and you're not going to be able to walk away from these harmful bills that you're signing, and you need to stop. I know it's going to be hard. A lot of people will respect you if you admit, like a man, that you've made some mistakes. The evidence doesn't defend this. You need to turn around. A lot of people respect you more than ever. If I was telling him privately, I'd say, I think you want to be president, and moral strength is the only way to get there, for you at this point, because you have such a legacy of promoting these bills in public and privately. You need to get out from under this. You need to veto this bill. And I'd also tell him, more importantly than the personal ambition, this is going to hurt a lot of kids.
This is experimental at this point, at best. I mean, we just don't know the outcomes because we haven't been doing it long enough to children.
Yeah, Wayne. So there was one study that, if we're being honest, out of the Netherlands, that kind of seemed like it helped. And this is puberty blockers on kids. These are kids with the parents were on board, which is basically not required in Colorado. And they were very healthy, very mentally healthy, very, very ideal candidates. And some of the data seemed like that might actually help those kids. Small number of kids. It was, I don't remember, a few dozen, less than 100. In science, you always have to reproduce data. And when the UK tried and the US tried, it has never helped kids. And despite the fact that we've had only failures and that we don't have any evidence that it helps or is safe on any kind of large level or high level science, we've gone ahead anyway, which shows you that it's not science pushing this, it's activism.
One of the arguments that people who defend this practice, this trend, this social contagion use is that if a child is born transgender or is born with gender dysphoria, the child either needs to act on this with support from adults or it's going to end in suicide.
Yeah, that's unfortunately I have heard that. And I've also had detransitioners like Luke Healy, who's out of California, tell me that they've been told that. In fact, Luke Healy was told by his therapist when he was, I think, 10 or 12, that he needed to tell his parents that he would kill himself if they didn't go along with his demands for hormones, which wasn't true. He wasn't thinking about suicide. That idea was given to him. And so we call this the suicide lie. And I tell people, I mean, that they're blackmailing parents over this suicide lie. And the reason is, even though this doesn't make any sense, and you would never predict that giving a kid cross-sex hormones is going to help them in any kind of situation. You would never predict that. Even still, if you show me data out of multiple countries, multiple places that it's helping kids, they're happier, they're living great lives and everything, I'd be like, oh, well, I mean, I might have to rethink. I must be wrong about this, okay? But that's not the case.
I would be in favor of it if there were data that suggested that this were good for children. I want what's best for children.
And I do too, and most of us do, and that's why when I was prescribing hormones to adults, for example, and I was looking at the WPATH, World Professional Association for Transgender Health guidelines, and it looked like science, and I was ready to do it if that was what helped people. I want to help the patient in front of me as much as any other doctor. So if there was really great data, most of us would feel a lot differently about this, but there's not. In face of that lack of data, what people tell us is if the kid doesn't do this, they're going to kill themselves, which again, you would never think that was a reasonable way to treat your wife, to threaten suicide. You would never feel good if your kid was doing that to you, threatening suicide. But for some reason, we're okay with it in this situation. What is the suicide data, though? Is this even true? Well, the answer is it's not. Unfortunately, in our society right now, if you go down to your local high school and you ask girls, how many of you have thought about committing suicide or thought about suicide in the past year, that number is going to be way higher than it should be. Maybe in the 30%, which is just crazy. If you ask trans kids, so-called, kids with gender dysphoria, kids with gender confusion, that number can be as high as the 40%, 41%, and so forth. Now, both of those numbers are too high. I would like the number to be 0. You might remember when we were kids, it was very rare for kids to think about it, much less do it. And I'd like to go back to those days in that sense. When they're talking about suicide, they're talking about ideation. And at the Supreme Court, the case was called Skermeti. It was listened to, it was heard in the Supreme Court in D.C., I think December 4, because I was there. I actually slept out on site on the concrete, went in, got to hear it. The ACLU lawyer that's in favor of all this had to admit to Justice Alito that it's true that there's no data that it decreases suicide. There only maybe ideation, but not actual suicide. So even their side, the ACLU, Chase Strangio, who herself claims to be a trans man, they agree that this does not decrease suicide. In one of the largest studies that I know of, 15,000 people out of the top gender clinic in the UK, 15,000 people, they had 4 suicides out of 15,000 kids. 2 were medicated, 2 were not. You had a rate of something like 0.013% per year. 0.013% per year. Much less than 0.1% a year. Thank God it's that low. I wish it were 0. That's still too many kids committing suicide. But the point is, you're not, there's no reason that you can blackmail a parent into doing something that'll hurt their kid. There's no reason that activists should be blackmailing legislators, that they got to pass these crazy laws like 1312. This is not proven to help. And honestly, this suicide lie is a coercive way to blackmail parents and legislators.
I can tell you as a parent and a grandparent that it works. It is because the child suicide rate is so alarmingly high. That card gets played a lot these days, and parents don't want to risk it. So that plays right into this. What do we call it? A social contagion. Maybe. Yeah, plays right into it.
We have friends, family that child suicide happened. I mean, God prevent that from any family. And if there's anything you or I or anybody on either side of the aisle, hopefully we do something to prevent that. Nobody wants that. I can tell you that on the other side, man, putting these kids to live their whole life with maybe no breasts when they have their child and they can't breastfeed their kid, or maybe they get painful milk production in their breasts and they can't even get rid of that milk. Not being able to have kids, maybe not being able to have sex with their partner, gay or straight. All these things are going to have just such an impact on their mental health. And I'm not going to do a Uno reverse and say it's going to kill people from suicide later, and because I don't think suicide is ever the right decision. But we really need to think about what we're doing to these kids. And we also really need to stop spreading the suicide lie, because any mental health person will always tell you to tell kids there's always a better option. There's always a better choice. It'll get better. You never normalize suicide with anybody, much less a kid. But for some reason, if it's a gender issue, you tell them, hey, many people commit suicide in your situation. If your parents don't give you this, many people commit suicide. We're completely upside down in every way on this gender issue, and it's harming kids.
Is there any evidence that actually going through with a gender transition, whether it's surgery or puberty blockers, however far it may go, that there's a higher suicide rate among that population?
The honest answer is there's not great data on that. There are some studies, in fact, that show that people after suicide are more likely to commit suicide. There was one that was like 19 times.
You mean after transition?
After transition
Yep.
surgery, I apologize.
No,
After
it's all right.
surgery, there's an increased risk there's increased suicides. People criticize that study, maybe rightfully, that both the patients in the after surgery and before surgery group weren't both trans identifying. They did a new study that just came out a few months ago where they were. And in that study also, the people that were post-suicide had more suicides. Post-surgery, I did it again. Post-surgery had more suicides. And so there is some suspicious data. Even the best study on their side by a guy named Jack Turbin, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, loves the trans kids. He published a study that supposedly showed that medicine decreased the risk of suicide in kids. And when you look at the data, there's a lot of problems with it. But one thing is the only objective outcome in the study, which doctors love objective outcomes, right? I don't want you to say like the medicine helped. I want to say I measured your blood pressure and it dropped your blood pressure by a certain number. I want to have an objective thing that me and another doctor both looking at it see the same thing. And the only objective kind of externally visible outcome that they had was the number of inpatient admissions for suicide attempts. That's something you can measure. And actually, the number of inpatient admissions for suicide attempts went up in Jack Turbin's own study for puberty blockers.
So there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that you have found to suggest that going along with this will save a child's life.
So don't ask me. Ask people that have spent year or more looking at a systematic review of all the studies that they can find that are good, evaluating how good they are. And we have them in Canada. We have them in the UK. There's no evidence that it helps the suicide rate.
What can we do about this in Colorado and other states where this is happening? It seems like adults have a responsibility to protect children from this.
I agree. I think we need to first understand that this is going to continue until someone stops it. We do need your listeners, me and you, to stand up and say no. So we're in the middle, whether it's a cult that has overtaken our society, whether it's a organizational system failure, as a safety engineer has described it, whatever it is, the brakes are off the train and it's going to keep going until someone else stops it. Because the people doing it, like our Colorado legislature, will not accept any kind of outside influence. I brought 9 doctors to talk to them one time and they didn't listen. We've brought detransitioners and they'll literally make fun of adult detransitioners. So they're not going to listen to outside influence. They have to be stopped.
They make fun of them. We're supposed to be open-minded to any of this type of activity, but if you want to go back to what you used to be, then you get made fun of.
Yeah, they get victim blamed or victim shamed. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, as long as in our state legislators know that they can do this, and as long as the activist organizations that talk to them every day, that probably bring finances involved, they're going to keep doing it until, especially in our state, we need Democrat voters who, most of whom are against this in polls. We need them to call their legislator, go down to their legislator's office and tell them we have to end this now.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming to the studio and talking to us about this very important subject. And thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks for this great conversation.
Everything's okay. Bring me southern kisses from your room. Meet me in the middle of the night. Let me hear you say everything's